All right, you know what time it is. It's time to talk about bans since we're getting one more year of the same standard format. And that's something that we're all thrilled about, I am sure, with a lot of cards that were essentially going to free up the metagame, sticking around a little bit longer. Now, if I'm being honest here, I am not expecting any bans. And the reason for that is in the article, they mentioned that all of this is for paper magic, and they want Standard to feel like a better investment for new players who are reluctant to get into Standard in the first place because it's a 2-year rotating format, which I think is kind of maybe misguided, honestly. From what I've heard from paper players, this will probably not help at all, especially if they're extending the format that is currently active, where people were waiting for rotation to to not have to buy Fables and things of the like. But now they're kind of stuck in limbo for like another year, which is kind of mad. Like the more I think about it, it just doesn't make sense to not rotate this year and then start the 3-year plan for rotating sets. Like, why would they not get this set, get this standard format over with, and then move on to the next one to free up new cards for those players that were waiting for those cards to cycle out, so they can purchase newer cards and feel like they can enter the standard format. But either way, that's yeah. So I don't think there's going to be any bans, unfortunately. But I am hoping that I'm incorrect on that one. It's not looking good for bans because again, if they ban cards, it kind of is counterintuitive to the fact that they want it to be a better investment. Like it's just kind of pointless if they start banning cards and extend the format for reasons that make it a safer investment. I don't know. Either way, but I have very strong opinions on bans. I am a ban advocate. I love the idea of just nuking cards out of orbit and freeing up and mixing things up basically. I love that idea, and I feel like Magic the Gathering Arena is not a format, is a platform, digital platform that can take advantage of constant changes. Like it's annoying that we're tied to paper because they've always been reluctant to ban cards because of paper investment. But on Arena, all you have to do is ban a card and give us wild cards, and then that's it. Like you can kind of mess around with like, oh, is banning this card good? Oh, we test it for like a week. Oh, it's not actually changing anything. We unban it. We ban something else. Like it's annoying that we're locked in by paper, and Magic the Gathering Arena just is not its own thing. But I've taken a long time already. I don't know. I'm sure you guys want me to get into the bans of what I want to be banned. And honestly, there are a lot of cards on that list. So let's just jump into it. All right, let's start things off with one of my spicy picks for bans. And it's one that I didn't realize was something I wanted until I realized that these were rotating out. Like I didn't notice that these were gonna rotate out, so I thought we were just stuck with it for a while longer. But now I'm actually angry because I've always had a huge problem as a deck builder with trying to build 3-color decks that are not in these Triumph colors. And all these lands basically lock you in or give you a huge incentive to be in these color combinations, and without the full set, because we've already had triumphs in the past and those are long gone and we're not getting a set of the new ones, so these are always going to be here as like the default route that you take for a 3-color deck, at least when your mana is quite intensive. So for example, like every time I try to build Mardu, which is a deck that I keep going back to, keep trying to make work, I look at the mana base and it just does not work. It does not work without a Triumph. Like, if I want to play cards like Brotherhood's End, I just can't because I don't have enough red sources. Or if I have enough red sources, then I have to play more tap lands that are not contributing to my other colors. It's absolutely impossible. The only way you can build a 3-color deck that is not in these colors is if one of your colors that you're playing in that 3-color deck is a very light splash. So, for example, if you have like a very light blue splash or something, and like I don't know, like a green black deck or something. If you're trying to play Sultai and you have like a green black base and then you're lightly splashing blue for counterspell, that's possible. But anytime you're trying to play a true 3-color deck, it is actually almost impossible. It is impossible unless you're running a specific deck like Esper Legends, but Esper already has a Triumph anyway, so it's kind of whatever. Like they can choose not to play the Triumph, but they can if they wanted to. So it's like they have the option, but they don't because they're playing the legendary land, which kind of acts as a Trom. And by the way, I do think that. All right, next up on the list we have another favorite of mine. As in, I really despise this card, and I feel like it's kind of ruining certain archetypes because it's in the format. So that would be Reckoner Bankbuster, a card that is just overtuned. Like there's no reason for a card to be flexibly a creature and card advantage and ramp. This card is way too cheap for what it does as a overstated vehicle, basically for two, and it curves out incredibly well with any 3-drop basically that is a creature that will have 3 power and be able to crew it. So essentially, there's not much of a downside to not drawing with it, because you can just play, if you're ahead, you'll just play your creature, swing for 4, and you've just got 4 damage for basically nothing, because if you're on the play, then you're not afraid of taking swing back damage. Anyways, what I'm trying to say is that this creature's stats are just absurd, and it stops people from attacking into it as well. Like if they play their 3 power creature and you have a 3 power creature, well, now they can no longer attack because you can crew and block. So this thing is too overstated. It's so cheap, and the flexibility of being able to draw with it is just insane, and the overall amounts of resources it gives to the player that plays it is absurd. It allows for decks that have when you're playing against decks with counter magic, for example, or decks with good answers, all you can do if your opponent doesn't develop, like most of the control decks don't exist because of this card, for example, because they can't hold up their answers, because you're not going to play anything. If you have Bankbuster, you're just going to draw. And then if you start drawing, well, the control player just starts losing card advantage, and they have to keep holding up their counterspell, because once they tap out, then you can tap out, and then it's over. Like, so this pretty much disables all aspects of more controlling strategies, and even in mid-range battles in general, if one player has answers and the other doesn't, the player with the answers that is afraid to develop because they want to hold up their answers will just not be able to against Bankbuster. They'll have to develop out of fear of your opponent just drawing every turn, and then eventually they have the Bankbuster online that gives them a treasure for some reason, and also the thing can crew itself afterwards as well. So this thing is just too much. It is not healthy for the metagame to have a colorless card like this that just completely dominates certain games in mid-range mirrors, for example, and just completely disables control decks, I think. At least as we have control at the moment. So like blue-white has like no good answer for this, for example. All right, next up we have the Wandering Emperor, a card that is extremely poorly designed for a healthy metagame. A Planeswalker is a permanent type that is extremely difficult to deal with in the game, and for that reason, they really should not be as flexible and as powerful as Wandering Emperor is. So Wandering Emperor is probably the most frustrating Planeswalker to face in the entire game right now. Basically, well, sure, it's in white, so I guess there's that, but the problem is that as a flash Planeswalker, you have to respect it as an aggressive player or as a mid-range deck in general. You have to respect that your opponent could have it, so it potentially prevents attacks out of risk of you just getting your creature exiled. So it can stall a board even if you don't have it in hand, like as the white player. As long as you're holding up 4 mana, your opponent has to hesitate. So it is just not healthy for the game to have a card where you're like, okay, if my opponent has it, I'm losing my creature. So should I just not attack? Because if they have it, I'll just kind of lose the game. Or should I attack? And if they have it, then it is what it is. And then if you like, it's ridiculous. So it creates mind games that is very unhealthy with a card that also represents board presence. So this would be less of a problem if the card was just strictly removal. But then you have the flip side of if your opponent doesn't attack, well, you can just play it as a summon a 2/2, and then you can plus it and have a 3/3 or make another 2/2. So it is board presence if your opponent doesn't attack, and it is removal if your opponent attacks. So it's a Planeswalker that is a permanent type that's difficult to deal with, and has the flexibility of either being board presence or just exiling stuff and gaining life. Like the gain life is really relevant too. Like everything about this card prevents attacks very effectively, and in control matchups, or in more controlling matchups where people are kind of waiting on their opponent to do stuff, this is just a proactive play. Like it's just instant speed proactive play. It is just absolutely disgusting. And it also acts as a combat trick, so it can be used in creature decks as well to just first strike one of your creatures. So it has the flexibility. Every single ability it has is way too flexible and is able to be used in every single situation that you can find yourself in for 4 mana, and that is just way too much. It's just not healthy for the metagame to have a card like this. All right, next up, sticking with the white theme here, we have the card Wedding Announcement, a card that just generates way too much board presence. This thing is just too good. I think the problem with it is that generating tokens every turn is already a strong effect for 3. Well, you only get up to 3, but then after that, you have a huge upside of it flipping into an Anthem, which is just completely degenerate. As an enchantment, it generates way too much board presence, and it pressures your opponent with a single card. It is a long-lasting threat to the game because of the Anthem effect being like so powerful with a bunch of damaging type removals, or even you being able to scale up your creatures into your opponent's blockers potentially, or you just having a good board state to block as well. So combine that with all the white planeswalkers that can also generate other creatures, it just becomes an absolute nightmare for any deck to deal with. And unfortunately, it is just too strong as an end step trigger. And on top of that, you can flexibly draw cards if you want to. So this card just does way too much. Like, my main issue with these 3 drops is that they cost 3 mana. That's the main problem. If this was like a 4 or 5 mana card, maybe it'd be a little bit less powerful. Even at 4, I don't know. I don't even know what it would look like at 4, but maybe should be banned at 4 too. I have no idea. Anything that just dominates your opponent a little bit too fast for the mana cost is a little bit too strong, I think. And this is one of those cards that just doesn't have efficient answers as an end step proc. Like, if this was upkeep, I think it would be a lot less powerful. But the fact that you can play this, immediately get a blocker in case you're behind, or if you're ahead, well, there's no downside. So it's just, yeah, it's just too strong. I don't know. I don't want this in the metagame. I feel like it will just become more and more of a problem, especially if we start banning other cards. All right, next up we have a card that a lot of people hate, and myself included. I think this card was designed for standard format without good mana. And the problem is we have really good mana in standard, and that means this card is either going to have to go or we have to ban a bunch of lands. So one of the two has to happen. I think this card is okay if you're assuming that it's only played in mono black, just because it's so restrictive to be playing just black that you'll have a bunch of other bad matchups. But I still think it should just go. Like, my philosophy is that if a card is doing things that is just way too much for like its mana cost, it should just be gone. Like, black needs to pay a lot of in general, black needs to pay a high price for removing enchantments. And the same can be said for removing planeswalkers. Actually, planeswalkers, they have like semi-efficient answers, like they have 2 mana basically remove stuff. But the issue with Invoke Despair is, again, its flexibility. So we're going down a recurring theme here, is if a card is flexible, that is a huge upside. And this card, it can basically be played in any scenario unless you're very far behind. But again, your deck should be built in a way where you'll never be in that situation. But, you know, sometimes you will be, but most of the time you won't. So the problem is that this deals with every single really annoying permanent type in the game. And that would be just enchantments and planeswalkers. And enchantments, usually we have like effects that cost the user in black to lose life as a price to pay for removing enchantments. But this is not the case for this card. Your opponent loses life if they don't have anything to sack. So the problem is that this thing just does too much. It can be used when your opponent has nothing. In that case, it's just straight up 6 damage burn. And you draw 3 cards, so it's insane card advantage and insane direct damage, so it's really good in those situations. And then if your opponent has a planeswalker, a creature, and an enchantment, while you're just getting like a 2.5 for 1 or 3 for 1, which is just absurd for 5 mana in a black deck. So it deals with every annoying permanent type that your opponent presents and buys you so much time. And since you can have 4 copies of the spell, well, the next one is probably going to be even more powerful once you get rid of those types of permanents. So the main issue, I think, if I had to sum it up, is just that every time your opponent doesn't have a permanent that they can sack, well, then they're just losing life. So there's almost like no, it's not like if this was just your opponent sacks this, and this, and maybe like you draw a card, if it wasn't the life loss as well, it's a combination of like literally everything. This card is pretty close, I think, to being like fine, like a really good card. But the fact that you have to add effects onto effects, like the lose life on top of the draw card, on top of it removing really good permanent types, and on top of it being really reliably castable in like pretty much every single deck that has black and that has another color is just ridiculous. So yeah, I don't know. This card really, I think, has to go just because it is played. It is too easy to play. Basically, that's the main issue. If this was 5 black, I think I would be okay with leaving it in the game. But the fact that for some reason people can play like 3 color decks and still cast this is just completely absurd, and it has to go. All right, another card that probably has to go is Farewell, I think. The problem is white decks are extremely good at fighting you into the mid game. So when they're extremely good at stalling you until you get to 5 and 6. And the problem is that at any point, if you have white mana in your deck, this is very easy to slot into your deck in any archetype, basically. So it essentially completely disables deck building strategies that are purely based off of those other permanent types that this can exile. So the issue is the exile more so, and the flexibility of being able to choose one or more. So this card, again, you're probably seeing a recurring thing here about me talking about flexibility. And flexibility in a card game is where you really start gaining too much power over other cards. If this was just exile everything, it would be a lot less powerful. But the fact that you can selectively choose things, so if your opponent is just playing like a pure artifact deck, well, you can like maybe leave your creatures in play. If your opponent's playing just a pure enchantment deck, maybe you get to keep your artifacts and your creatures, or maybe you get to exile the graveyard if they're playing reanimation. Like it's just it does too much. And the main problem is that it's an exile. I think that's the main problem. It's flexible and it's an exile. And exiling is extremely powerful in this game. That means like all strategies that rely upon things dying potentially, or them using cards from like putting cards in their graveyard after they get destroyed and bringing them back, that's not possible with Farewell. So I think it's a little bit too restricting to deck building. And I would much rather see a card like Sunfall just stay in standard than a card like this. Or maybe, yeah, maybe they should print a card that's like destroy all non-land permanents for like 7 or something. That would be okay. I would be totally fine with that. But Farewell is just something that we should not have, I think, in standard, especially if it's going further into the future. Well, for 1 year, basically. I think this card should probably go, honestly. All right, next up we have Liliana, which is a card that is a reprint, and it's a very powerful card, and they reprinted it for standard, which is completely absurd. So, again, I have a huge problem with 3-mana planeswalkers. I think 3-mana planeswalkers are just degenerate, and well, I have the problem with 3-mana cards in general that impact the game quickly and effectively, and this is definitely par for the course. So this is an extremely devastating effect for creature decks that have, well, any creature deck that's trying to curve out, because black has the tools to destroy creatures on curve. So that means that you're probably going to have like 1 creature on average on turn 3 when this is playable. So you play your creature and they play Lily and they sack your creature, and suddenly, well, you have to worry about attacking this before it gets another minus off, or you just got 2-for-1. I mean, there's just like, that should sum it up. The 2 black pips are again too easy to cast. We're in standard where every time you have a colorless symbol, then the card is castable basically. And in 3-color decks and 2-color decks, it's just too easy to cast, and this card is just way too powerful. And if it sticks for a little bit too long, so if you never are able to attack it and it gets the minus off, well, you're just screwed. But that's not a huge issue. I think the main problem is that it's discard and sacrificing a creature. Both are powerful effects, and it can alternate between them and get a 2-for-1 relatively quickly. So it only needs 3 turns of it staying on the board, and then you've lost 2 creatures and they get a 2-for-1. So just complete nonsense, and really does not help standard to have a card this strong. I think it does not help. Even if there are metagames where it's going to be not as good because people are playing like aggro decks or something, is just not healthy for this. It will turn off certain strategies if you're playing as a black deck. Well, if you're playing this in a black deck against other people who are playing certain strategies. All right, I guess it's time to go with one that everybody wants, and one that I also want, and that is Shield Red. Shield Red, a card that many argue should not be banned, but everybody has their different reasonings for, or their reasons for bans in general. I'm again following the philosophy of if this is a deck building limitation for people, then it should not be in the game. And there's another aspect that I also think cards that can win by themselves should be banned. So, and this is one of those cards. Essentially, Shield Red forces you to play answers. So, for example, during the top 8 of the previous PT, we had Soldiers versus Shield Red, and Soldiers doesn't really play that much removal, and they ended up having to board in a ton of removal, and even then they didn't find the removal, and Shield Red just won the game by itself. So the issue is that not only are you forced to play removal spell in pretty much any deck in the metagame because Shield Red is such a mainstay, you also have to draw it before it starts dealing absurd amounts of damage. And the problem is the power level standard is a little bit too high, and we have reach in standard. It's not like this card is putting you down to 2 and then you're like, oh, I'm just completely safe. Well, you can die to another Shield Red, you can die to Invoke Despair, you can die to Light Up the Night, you can die to Chandra, you can die to Trespasser Pings. The problem is we have too many tools. This card would be much weaker if standard rotated, because then people could like maybe go lower on life and be in a little bit less danger, because there wouldn't be cards like Invoke Despair, there wouldn't be cards to close out the match, and maybe the metagame would be a little bit slower, allowing for people to find those answers a little bit faster. But that is not the case with the current metagame, and if we're still moving in this direction, that means that only decks that have extremely reliable ways of killing Shield Red will just be at the top if Shield Red is still like a mainstay in the metagame. And that pretty much turns off every single like creature strategy or decks that have not great removal spells or decks that don't have many removal spells, because even with 4 copies of a removal spell, if you don't find it, you're just you die too fast. Like this card closes the gap a little bit too fast. It will either put the player who owns Shield Red out of range completely by just gaining them like upwards of 10 HP, if not more, but it also drains your opponent. Like it also makes your opponent lose life. So you're on a clock, and your opponent's getting further and further away from you being able to like close out the game fast enough before they find another one or before they find answers to whatever you're doing. Overall, it's just an overstated creature that can block way too well. I forgot to mention the stats, I guess. So it's an incredible blocker, incredible attacker. Death Touch is not super relevant, but can be. And it also has that static. So it completely dominates creature decks, and it is a snowball mechanic that should not be in the game, essentially. All snowball mechanics should be banned to a certain extent. That's another philosophy that I have, is that any card that puts your opponent in an even worse spot from you being in a winning position, aka like we'll talk about Fable in a second, but same thing for Wedding Elves. A lot of these cards that I've mentioned are exactly that, actually. I think every single card that I've mentioned so far, maybe, I can't really remember, is a win more card. But to degrees that is not healthy, right? Like, if you are winning the game, you're winning even harder by casting those cards on curve. You know what I mean? So that's another thing that you should follow when I'm talking about bans, is that I'm evaluating basically power compared to, or value to mana cost. I'm evaluating deck building restrictions for other players if you're playing that card, and I'm also evaluating snowball mechanics. So all those. By the way, if you don't know what snowballing is, well, I mean, I guess I'd describe it, is that you win more by playing those cards if you're winning. Anyways, let's move on to the next card. I guess I'll put a card that I'm not like, I'm on the fence about. So I'm gonna include a few of these where I'm like, yeah, maybe it should be banned. I'm not 100% sure, but I feel like this card is definitely doing too much. Like I would just ban it. Personally, I'm a big advocate for like just banning cards like left and right. I don't care. Like just digital platform, separate paper and MTGA, just ban it. And if it's not a problem, well, I don't know. I guess there would be no way to know if it's not a problem. But I don't like this card being in the game. I feel like Ward discard a card is just too strong on top of graveyard interaction and on top of drain as a 3/3 creature. So I think this card is overstated for the effects it brings to the table, and the fact that it can flip is an upside as well into a 4/4, which is completely overstated for a 3-drop. As a 1-pip black spell, so 2 colorless, 1 black, so really flexible, really able to play in anything. As I mentioned, the standard ban is way too good, so this is not even remotely a problem to cast. And Yeah, I don't like that it does way too much as a 3 drop, and I have problems with 3 drop. The reason I have less of a problem with this is that it is a creature at the end of the day. It can get swept. You don't want to remove it with a targeted removal spell, obviously, because discarding a card is so broken. But yeah, honestly, just get rid of it. I don't know. I don't care. I like the card a lot. This is one of the cards that I do enjoy playing a lot, but I think it would be healthier for the metagame to not have access to this, because there's bound to be a situation where there's a deck that just gets absolutely farmed by Graveyard Trespasser. And even that could be the case like right now. There are decks that just don't have sweepers or that are playing like creatures and stuff, where this would be a massive problem. I guess while we're on the topic of cards that I'm not sure should be banned, but I'm definitely leaning towards banning them, would be Thalia. I think Thalia, if I evaluate it in this metagame where we have a lot of removal spells and we have good sweepers, I think it's a little bit less of a problem, but I still think this card is extremely toxic as a 2 drop that has first strike. I think this card just is a problem, but it's only a problem for certain decks if you don't have like many answers to it. I think the bigger picture is that this card comes along with Skrelv, which makes it really, really devastating for some decks, because Skrelv is a card that eats up the same type of removal as Thalia. So if your opponent curves out Skrelv, Thalia, Rafin, for example, then you're kind of out of the game, honestly. And as a 2/1 creature, it is extremely good in creature matchups as well. So, you know what? I'm definitely leaning towards banning this card. Alright, I guess it's time. It's time for Fable. And Fable the Mirror Breaker, best card in Standard. Pretty much nobody can argue that it isn't. And I will go through why this card is so problematic. In a pretty like, this will really tell you a lot about why this card is strong if you don't really understand why it is. I know people have like the feeling that it's strong, but maybe you just yeah, I'll explain it so it's easier to like really capture why this card is so broken. So there are 3 aspects of a card game with like a battlefield that are paramount to like winning the game or towards winning the game. And that would be board presence, card advantage, and mana ramp. So, or mana in general. So like in Magic, mana, but like your resource, your main resource to cast cards. And in this game specifically, in Magic the Gathering, the mana aspect is extremely crucial because your mana comes from you drawing that resource from your deck and playing it onto the battlefield. It's not like other games where your resource is generated automatically, like Hearthstone, for example. You actually have to find lands to be able to cast your spells. So mana ramp in this game has even more value than in other games. All right, so what's the problem? Well, the issue is that this is a permanent type that is not a creature, that summons a creature that has decent stats for 3. It's not like a 1/1 or a 0/2 or something. It's a creature that is relevant in the early game as a 2/2. It can trade with most other 2 drops. So on the play, that's like not even a problem because you're the one playing the 3 drop. Your opponent has a 2 drop on the board. Like if they want to attack into it, they'll probably lose their 2 drop. But that's not even the strong part about it. The strong part is that obviously, if it attacks, it makes a treasure token. So it's not even like if this creature connects face, you get a token. It's on attack. So you get the reward immediately. So it's really good with instant speed removal if you need that extra bit of mana to cast it. Like if you have 1 mana open, you get a treasure, you cast Go for Throat. There you go, your token lives and generates another mana. So the problem is the chapter 1 is extremely relevant early game as a snowball mechanic, as a snowball tool, generating mana and also being tied to a creature for board presence. So it's relevant in the late game as well. If you're behind, you could play this and you'll have a blocker. It's not like you're gaining no board presence. So you have board presence with it, and it's a relevant statted creature. It's not like ridiculous. It's not like a joke. Like it should have been like a 1/1 or a 0/1 or something completely garbage. I think it should have been. If it's tied to mana ramp, it should have been a terrible creature. Chapter 2, another problem. So all of these are problems because they're exactly lined up as they are. Like I feel like maybe if this was like chapter 2 first, it would be like a little bit less problematic. Like, it's just a combination of all things. It would probably still be, no, it would be less good, I think, if it was chapter 2 going first. That's chapter 1. But chapter 2, so you have your creature, you have your potential mana ramp. Your opponent has to answer it, or you get a treasure, which is extremely advantageous in a metagame where snowballing is a thing, right? You have Shield Red, you have Invoke Despair, so you can go from 3 to 5 immediately. Again, the problem is snowballing overall. So mana allows you to snowball faster. And you know what else helps you snowball faster? Card selection. Draw 2, discard 2 is just insane in this game, tied to a card that is already good. So it's all upside. In a card game, one of the main weaknesses is that sometimes when you don't have enough card draw or enough card selection, you'll find yourself in a situation where you do not have the right cards at the right time. And this just bypasses that completely. Are you flooding? Well, then you discard both lands, you redraw spells, for example, on average. So the issue is that we are in a card game where you can draw lands, so you have that variance. The mana ramp is more relevant, and the draw discard is more relevant because if you're drawing too many lands, it allows you to consistently come back. Like you'll just gain a bunch of spells, so it allows you to continue the snowball, which is just absurd. And if you have no lands, you can just discard 2 spells and potentially draw lands. So it fixes your hand. It fixes your hand, allows you to snowball, or allows you to recover, because if you have a bad hand, this can just completely fix your hand entirely. So it either snowballs you or allows you to come back into the game with a better hand than you had before. So card selection is just broken in this game, especially if it's tied to almost no mana cost. I would argue this is basically a 0 mana cost, draw 2, discard 2, because of what we're getting in Chapter 3. So Chapter 3 is another creature. This time the stat line is relevant, but not that good on turn 5. 2/2 is whatever. But the problem is that this creature has an activated ability. First of all, this enchantment is not legendary, so you can play multiple copies of it. And the ability copies a creature that is non-legendary, and it gains haste, and you sacrifice it at the beginning of the next end step. And it's instant speed for some reason. Like most of these effects that I've seen that are tied to weaker cards are sorcery speed only. So you can do it on your opponent's turn. So you can gain a blocker that can block without you losing a card. It's just ridiculous. The issue as well is if you draw multiple copies of Fable the Mirror Breaker, well, you can just go for an infinite Reflection of Kiki-Jiki combo where you have 2 Kiki-Jikis, you copy one at your opponent's end step, you copy another one with the copy, you do it again, you do it again, you do it again. So for each mana, you're gaining a Kiki-Jiki that can attack the next turn. So if, for example, if you're on turn 6, you dump 6 mana into that, well, you have 6 Kiki-Jikis with the 2 on the board that are already there from your 2 Fables. Well, that is 8 2/2s. 8 2/2s, that's a lot of damage. And yeah, you can copy cards that are also broken in this format, like Harvester, allowing you to basically gain an infinite source of removal spells on top of blood tokens. Completely ridiculous. You can copy Appraiser, you can copy Trespasser. Everything with an enter the battlefield effect gets incremental value from this absurd. It just gets way better. It is a card that is never bad. And on turn 3 is the most backbreaking card that you will ever face, especially because of play draw. There's this problem on top of problem. Like, I'm just remembering another issue. Another problem is that this game has an absurd problem with play draw, which is kind of the main source of why snowballing is a problem. Snowballing is a problem because you have innate snowballing from play draw. The player on the play can start the game. They start the game, literally. They're the one who sets the pace. They're at an innate tempo advantage from your opponent. They're the one setting the pace. They do 1 drop, 2 drop, or just 2 drop, 3 drop. And Fable on 3 allows you to potentially go from 3 to 4 with a creature on the battlefield, with the card selection, and with a looming threat of Reflection of Kiki-Jiki coming on turn 5. So this card puts your opponent so far behind where they might have to expend their premium removal spells on the first chapter to stop you from going from 3 to 5. And then you also get the card selection to keep up the pressure after they just used their removal spell. And then you get a threat. So they have to answer 2 threats, and you're most likely consistently going to have good cards in hand from the chapter 2. Anyways, I don't know. Do I have anything else to say about this card? I don't know, maybe I'm forgetting something. There's probably some other thing. Oh, also, this is a one red card, one pip. You only need one red source. Ridiculous. Like this should have been like a three red maybe, and then would it be fine then? Maybe actually, because then only mono red can play it. The problem is that everybody can play this. All you have to do is play like a tiny bit of red source. Like you need like I don't know 10, 12, 12 red sources or something to cast this. It's with standard mana, it's just ridiculous. Anyways, I'm ready to move on. I don't know if you. I'm sure there are things I'm forgetting, but yeah, I don't know. And I guess while we're on this page, I should probably mention that I'm not sure if I would ban this. This is another card I'm like really on the fence about. I feel like it's not healthy for the game to have a card like this. I'm not sure. I'm not 100% sure yet. Um, I don't know. This is a card that is flexible again. So the main reason I think it might be bannable is because it's flexible. I feel like destroying all artifacts for of mana value 3 or less gives this card way too much value as like a tech card. If it was just the sweeper, I think it would be less problematic. But the fact that it's flexible enough to be a hate card as well is maybe problem. I don't know. I think I would lean towards not banning it and seeing how the metagame turns out. Because this is a tool that's definitely useful as like a counter to aggro decks. So I I would say I wouldn't ban this. And then if it becomes a problem, I would ban it later. But right now I want to see how the metagame would turn out without those other cards, and then we'll see like if this would have needed a ban or not, basically. But that's the thing. Again, digital platform, I think it should be like totally fine. Like if this becomes a problem, just get rid of it. But just an honorable mention, essentially. All right, I guess Cruelty of Geeks. Cruelty of Geeks. Um, I'm also on the fence about this one. The reason I'm on the fence, well, this card is obviously like way too good. I think first of all we can say that it's way too good. The read ahead is what makes this card broken, and putting any creature card from any graveyard onto the battlefield is so broken for 5. Like, I think this card does way too much, but the reason it's problematic is because there are cards that can come back from the graveyard that are broken. But I think it's still better to ban the reanimation card than those cards. I don't know. I would honestly ban all of them. I don't know. This one I'm iffy about. Like I'm not sure. I'm still one like what if we just ban the cards that can be reanimated off of this instead? I don't know. But I think this card is just way too good. Like a tutor on top of a reanimation on top of a discard spell flexibly with the read ahead where you can choose any chapter for 5 mana. This card gets better the stronger standard is, I think. Um actually, is that even the case? No, maybe it's just it might be better the weaker standard is. Because then people are playing slower decks. Maybe, I don't know. If that assumption is correct, then I guess it would be better if the format was weaker. Anyways, I don't know. I just ban it. Just ban it. I don't know. I don't care. Like who cares about this? I think if you want to reanimate cards, I think you have to pay a price. And the price is usually that your reanimation spell is just a reanimation spell. That's the price, right? And sometimes it will only reanimate your creatures. I think this card is just way too easy to cast. It's way too flexible, and it just brings too much value to the table as a flexible card. And I think it's not good. Like I think we have other reanimation spells. Just use those. Like why does this have to be a thing? It's just too oppressive, I think. All right. Probably the only blue spell I'd ban. Actually, that's not true. We'll see. Yeah. Okay, I'll mention something else after. Make disappear. A card that is countering everything at any point in the game, other than like uber late game. That is just broken. I mean, Quench has a drawback because a Quench is like just no casualty. Like imagine this card with no casualty. 2 mana counter spell unless they pay 2. Well, That's good early game, but the downside is it's really bad in the mid game because then they can just play around it super easily. That is not the case with Meek Disappear. Not because it forces your opponent to pay 4 potentially, but because it forces them to pay 2 increments of 2. So it's not even a card that they can answer back with another counterspell. It is just dumb. I think counterspells should not be this strong, because if they're this strong, and especially, well, actually they could be this strong, but they would have to be, it would have to be an effect that's not tied to board presence. The problem is casualty is a mechanic that can be used by any deck that plays any amounts of creatures, right? And that is not good because there are extremely efficient ways of generating creatures with like Wandering Emperor, with Wedding Announcement, with Fable. Like, we have a lot of ways to generate tokens, for example, and things that summon more things, or there's always going to be a creature in a deck in standard. And this gains so much value because of it. This is definitely much weaker in like a pure control shell with literally nothing. But even then, they have Wandering Emperors. So it's like another problem. Like, but yeah, this card is just degenerate and really feels incredibly frustrating. Like as a counter spell. Like, I don't know. Like, counter spells should definitely feel somewhat restrictive, and for 2 mana, this definitely does not. I guess I should mention the other blue spell that I'm talking about. And that would be Corpse Appraiser. Corpse Appraiser, again, is kind of following suit with Invoke Despair, where this was not meant to be a card that is easily castable. And pretty much any deck that is in Grixis colors can just play this on turn 3. And that is not good, because removal spell is extremely good in standard. Removal spells are good in standard. And this card is just insane card advantage. You're getting a 3/3, which is par for the course for a 3-drop. That's good stat line. And you get to look at top 3, put one in your hand, rest in your graveyard. Rest in your graveyard is way better than putting them at the bottom most of the time. So this thing is just way too good. It can fuel itself. Like, you look at top 3, you have a creature in top 3, you grab something else, put the creature in the graveyard, you have another Corpse Appraiser, just eat that creature. Yeah, honestly, should just not be in standard with the mana base as it is. I think this should have been a card where, in theory, you would have trouble casting it, so the reward is worth the difficulty. You know what I mean? Like, the reward is in line with how hard it is to cast. But this is basically like a no. This has basically no mana restrictions almost as a Grixis deck. Like, you're just gonna be able to cast this almost at any point. Mana base is just too good. The Triumph is a huge problem. And I guess while we're on the topic of vampires, Blood-Tithe Harvester, bye-bye. Just one of the most ridiculous 2-drops. Again, casting cost way too easy to hit. As a 2-color 2-drop in standard, it's coming down on a curve almost every time in any red-black deck. The Blood token is a fantastic token. So again, as I mentioned before, card selection is so insane in this game compared to other games, because you can discard lands in the late game, or you can discard spells early game to find lands. So this is a 2-drop with 2-drop stat line, 3/2, the classic, generates a blood token, which is a really good token because of card advantage, or not card advantage, because card selection, and can act as a scaling removal spell with -X, which is even better than just like some kind of destroy effect. I don't know how that would work, but like some kind of destroy effect. -X goes around indestructible and stuff like that. It is just absolutely absurd that this can either defensively act as a removal spell or just hit your opponent in the face for 3. Like, just no. And then with Fable, it becomes like a removal bot where every turn you're just removing your opponent's biggest creature, like, or biggest threat. Again, the problem is that it scales off of itself as well. So you draw multiple copies, well, suddenly they get so much better as removal. Anyways, so it's just get rid of it. All right. Hello, Atraxa. Goodbye, Atraxa. Atraxa is a card that is way too good. First of all, because you can reanimate it. And second of all, because standard mana is very good. Again, the problem is that this card is very easy to cast. We have well, very easy, I say that, but like comparatively to having less good mana, like it's easy, it's way easier to cast than it should be, essentially, is what I'm saying. We have the legendary land, the Plaza of Heroes, that was basically allowing this card to be cast in Rakdos. Like imagine you can cast this card in a black red shell where you're fulfilling only one of the color requirements for this card. The three of the other ones are not in the mana base. Plaza of Heroes, Triomes that can basically act as your two colors plus the splash color. It's just not good. This effect should be a very restrictive effect where, again, same thing with Appraiser, where the casting cost is so restrictive that it's worth that amount of power. But this amount of power is ridiculous, and it's not that hard to cast, and it also is insane with reanimation effects. So just get rid of it. I don't think it's healthy. There are decks that will just auto lose to this on, like, if you reanimate it on turn 5, they will just have no way of ever dealing with it. And the amount of card advantage you gain from it, if you can also hard cast it, so even if they have like interaction for your graveyard, the fact that you can hard cast it is a huge problem. Treasures are a problem. Fable is a problem for like anything, everything. This card is just, it's not good. This card should not be a standard, really. It's a commander card. I don't even know anything about commander. I just heard somebody say that was a commander card. All right. Do you guys like Hearthstone? Because I quit Hearthstone because of cards like this. Itali. Itali is a 7-drop that can randomly win you the game, which is probably not good, right? Like, no. I don't think we want a random 7/7 creature that has decent stats and has trample and has an activated ability that is actually good. Also doing the most random thing ever, like in a card game, where you're using your opponent's deck and then you randomly get a card off of their deck and you randomly take a card off of your deck. Anyways, the keyword is random. And yeah, it's just toxic. It is just not good. A game like Magic should not have effects like this. It removes the skill in the game. It is, well, obviously it's 7 mana, so it is pretty expensive. But the problem is we have Fable, so treasures. We have reanimation effects, Cruelty of Geeks. We have Breach the Multiverse now, which is insane with this card, because then you can get like your opponent's creature on this, like you get 2 of your opponent's things basically. Anyways, just ban it. All right, here's Rafin. Rafin is just too good. Rafin, the problem with Rafin is that it has ward. It has ward. It's extremely easy to cast. This was probably meant to be difficult to cast, I would assume, because if you assume that everybody's casting this on turn 3, that's just insane. Like, this card generates stats, card selection, fuels your graveyard potentially, and is also a flyer with a defensive stat line that can scale itself up with +1/+1 counters. And it has ward. I think the main problem is that ward as a mechanic is dangerous, especially if you add ward that screws with your opponent's mana efficiency or card advantage. There are 2 ways to do it. Again, as I mentioned before, 2 major aspects of a card game, and especially in Magic: mana, so the amount of mana you have, or mana efficiency in general, and card advantage. So a card like Trespasser has ward discard, that's card advantage, that's dangerous. Ward 1 tax, so that means they have to pay 1 extra mana when targeting it. Means that you're further pushing your advantage from play draw. Your opponent's on the draw, they're at a mana disadvantage automatically, and then you put them even further into a mana deficit. So it means it's pretty much almost impossible to interact with unless you have a very specific 1 mana spell, or if you're on the draw, for example. And as a snowballing card, generating stats, as well as being a card that protects itself somewhat, or very well early game, it just becomes an absolute nightmare. It becomes an absolute nightmare. It scales off of your board presence, so it's a really good snowballing tool. The wider your board state, the more stats or card selection you're getting. It has incredible synergy with Shield Red as a way to just not care about having blockers because you're just gaining a ton of HP, for example, by attacking with everything. It's just too good. Like flying, the stat line, like a combination of literally everything makes this card way too good. I guess another honorable mention for me would be Skrelv. Skrelv, I think, is a dangerous card, and it gets better the more aggressive creatures or the more oppressive creatures we have. So this is another snowballing tool. It's a 1-drop that will protect your busted 2-drop like Thalia, and protect your busted 3-drop like Rafin, and also potentially protect your busted Shield Red, a 4-drop. So the problem is that once we have a curve with cards that are already disrupting your opponent to degrees that are just too high, so starting from that, this becomes incrementally more powerful. So the better your curve, the better this card is. Or the more there's other things, like that's just a global thing. I mean, if you have like high value targets as well, this gains value, but in general, Esper Legends is the main thing to look at here with Skrelv. And yeah, it's just a card that basically duplicates the danger of your other cards while also being a removal magnet. So what I mean by that is that if you look at removal spells that are currently in standard, and probably the best thing you can do against Thalia and Rafin is cut down. But you only have 4 cut down. And you have to cut down Skrelv, which means you need another cut down. Because otherwise Thalia is going to tax your Go for the Throat, and then you can't cast it. And then Rafin comes down, and you can't destroy it because you have to kill Thalia first, because it's taxing your spell. But then Rafin also has Ward 1, so then you can't remove anything. And if it sticks, the problem is, here's the problem. The problem with 12 is that it's a protection spell, but it's also a snowball to, well, okay. Oh, there are so many, oh my god, there's so many problems with Skrelv, actually. I just realized. Skrelv, ability costs 0 mana potentially. And the life loss is not really a problem since you're playing a proactive deck. So there's that. First of all, mana efficiency, going back to the 3 pillars of whatever, I don't know what to call them. Mana efficiency. Skrelv, 0 mana potentially. Also, Skrelv can bypass blockers for your other creatures. It means that you're not even safe if you generate a board where, they're stalled. Where, you're like, okay, they can protect from removal spells. I'm just going to build a board state where they can't attack. Well, they can. So, they can attack because can't be blocked by creatures of that color. So the problem is that it's twofold. It's protection from removal spells while also being a way to bypass your opponent's blockers. It's essentially completely neutralizing both aspects of the game that can be problematic for your other creatures. One being blockers where they can't attack, and the other one being those creatures getting removed. I don't know. There's not much else to say about Skrelv. I just think it should not be in the game. It's a little bit too strong as a 1-drop. All right, that is going to do it. Honestly, I'm sure I forgot a few cards. I'm not going to lie, but you can leave those in the comments. And yeah, obviously I've gone through a lot today. I can't really think of many other cards. I don't want to go through the whole collection. But yeah, it always happens when you're making a list. Since I didn't write anything down, that I'm bound to forget like maybe 2 or 3 cards, if not more. But again, pretty much everything that you can think of, I just want banned. Like I want a standard format that is so low power level that deck building actually matters. The higher the overall power level of a format, the more difficult it is to like actually build something new, because usually those are going to be, unless it's like there's a potential. Okay, it's not that, it's that higher power level formats are harder to balance because you need everything to be about, like the powerful cards need to be matched by other powerful cards, and then there needs to be a balance, and it's harder to get that balance right when the power level scales up, because you have cards that are doing things that are a little bit like too narrow, like you have like, or too narrow or too generic, like Fable. So those cards are hard to balance out with other cards. Anyways, I'm getting off track here. Well, either way, I hope you enjoyed this vid. Yeah, just keep in mind that this is just how I view things. Obviously, I know that I'm pretty extreme when it comes to my views on bans. I would literally ban every card in standard if I could, quite literally. And yeah, that's gonna do it. Hope you enjoyed the vid. I'll see you in the next one. If you enjoy my content and would like to help me keep making it, consider supporting me over on Patreon, where you can access to a bunch of bonus videos, as well as other rewards depending on the tiers. And thank you so much to all the lovely patrons that are already subscribed. I appreciate it very much. And I will see you all in the next video.